The sun had barely risen over the canyon when Silas Ward pressed his hand against his back, hoping the pain would ease. For 3 days, something had been growing there, hard and unyielding, pulsing like it had a heartbeat of its own. Now, I don't know about you, but I've had aches and bruises from hard work before, and most of the time they fade. But imagine feeling something inside you, not fading, not healing, but alive. Silas stood before the cracked mirror in his lonely cabin, peeling off his worn shirt. The reflection staring back was more than unsettling. The skin between his shoulders burned red, swollen, hot as if fire lived under his flesh. And deep down he knew this wasn't just another rancher's scar. It was something else, something waiting. Have you ever had that moment where your gut tells you the truth, even before your mind catches up? That's where Silas found himself, caught between fear and a strange certainty that whatever was inside wanted out. He knew there was only one person in those wide, empty miles he could trust, Mercy Whitmore. Folks in that territory swore by her. 20 years tending wounds, stitching up cattle hands, fighting off sickness where no doctor dared to stay. She wasn't just a healer, she was the kind of woman who carried the weight of other people's pain without complaint. And for Silas, riding toward her cabin was like clinging to the last bit of hope. When he finally reached her, Mercy didn't waste words. One look at his pale face, one glance at the angry red swelling, and her expression turned grave. Not fear, not surprise, something else. Concern laced with recognition. She didn't touch it, didn't even dare. Instead, she whispered, almost to herself, "This isn't healing. This was buried a long time ago." Think about that. Buried. How could a man carry something hidden in his flesh since childhood without ever knowing? What kind of secret would someone go to such lengths to conceal? As Silas stood in the quiet of that morning, the truth pressed down heavier than the pain in his back. He realized his life, everything he thought he knew, was about to change forever. Because sometimes the past doesn't stay buried. Sometimes it claws its way to the surface, demanding to be seen. The cabin was silent except for Silas's ragged breathing. He gripped the edge of the wooden chair, knuckles turning white, as Mercy Whitmore leaned close with her blade. Her hands were steady, too steady for what she was about to do. The first cut lit up his body like lightning. Pain shot through him deeper than any barbed wire gash or broken rib he'd ever known. And yet he held still, because whatever lived under his skin had to come out. I don't know if you've ever felt pain that seemed to reach past the body, digging into something more personal, almost spiritual. That was what Silas faced. Every second dragged, sweat pouring down his face despite the cool morning air. Then came a sound, soft, metallic. Something small dropped into Mercy's waiting hand. When she wiped away the blood, both of them froze. Nestled in her palm was a tiny cylinder, no bigger than a man's thumb, sealed with wax at both ends. The metal was tarnished, etched with markings neither of them recognized. It didn't belong there. It didn't belong anywhere. Mercy's eyes narrowed. Her voice was low, almost reluctant. "Silas, someone put this in you when you were a baby. The scar tissue, it's been inside you for decades." Now think about that for a moment. A child, barely old enough to draw breath, carrying a secret buried beneath his skin. Who would do such a thing? And why? Was it protection? A curse? A message meant to stay hidden until the right time? I imagine Silas's heart must have been pounding harder than the pain itself. Because if this wasn't an accident, then his entire life had been built on something he never chose. And I'll be honest, it made me wonder too. How much of what we carry, the scars, the burdens, are really ours? Or were they placed there long before we understood the weight? Silas held the cylinder in trembling fingers, its warmth almost human after all those years beneath his flesh. Whatever truth it contained had been waiting his whole life to be revealed. And now, staring at that strange object, the real question hung heavy in the air. Why would anyone hide such a secret inside a child?
and what would happen when the seal finally broke.
The morning was quiet, almost too quiet, when the sound of hooves broke the stillness around Mercy's cabin. A rider came into view, his dark coat dusted from long miles, his posture sharp as a hawk watching its prey. His name was Gideon Flint, and the way he dismounted, calm, deliberate, made it clear he wasn't the kind of man who stumbled on the places by accident. He looked at Silas, really looked, like he already knew what he'd find, and with a voice that carried the weight of someone used to getting answers, he asked about the scar on Silas's back. Imagine that. Someone you've never seen before rides straight to your door and names the very mark you've hidden your whole life. How would you even breathe in that moment? Then came the revelation. Gideon spoke of the cylinder Mercy had pulled from Silas's flesh. It wasn't just metal. It wasn't just some cruel trick of fate. No, it held documents sealed away for 23 long years, proof of lies and theft tied to the land itself. Papers that, if revealed, could tear apart the mining consortium that had carved its power across the valley. And worse, it was the same secret that had gotten Silas's father killed. The story he'd grown up believing, that his parents died in a wagon accident, was nothing but smoke. The truth was darker, more deliberate. His father had been silenced for daring to expose fraud on a scale that could ruin men of influence. Before Silas could even process that weight, the horizon darkened. Dust rose from the canyon trail. 6 riders in black fanned out around the cabin, weapons glinting in the sun. Marcus Stone's men. Stone, the very man accused of pulling the trigger on Silas's father, was here to finish the job. The air turned heavy, charged with the kind of tension you feel before a storm. Gideon leaned close, his voice urgent, not asking, but commanding. Open it, now. If those papers fall into their hands, everything your father died for will be lost. Silas's hands shook as he broke the wax seal. Inside, aged parchment unfurled, maps, legal claims, signatures that meant nothing to him but everything to the men who killed for them. And in that instant, with Stone's gunmen circling like wolves, Silas realized his life had never truly been his own. He had been carrying the weight of justice buried in his flesh since the day he was born. And now the past had arrived at his doorstep, armed and ready to decide whether truth would finally see the light or be buried with him.
The standoff outside Mercy's cabin felt like time itself had slowed. Silas could hear the pounding of his own heartbeat, louder than the rifles cocking around him. And then came the betrayal, or what looked like betrayal. Gideon Flint, the man who had claimed to know the truth, raised his voice and called out to Marcus Stone, declaring that Silas had the papers. For a moment, Silas's world tilted. Imagine trusting someone, even briefly, and watching them hand you over to the very man who murdered your father. The weight of that kind of betrayal can crush a person. I've seen it before. In history, in life, when the one you thought was on your side seems to join the enemy. And maybe you felt it too, in smaller ways. That sting of someone you believed in turning their back. But as Gideon walked toward Stone's men, Silas noticed something strange. His steps were too slow, too deliberate, almost as if he was giving them time. Mercy caught it too, her eyes narrowing with suspicion. And that's when the truth began to unravel. When the rider spread out and Stone pressed for the papers, Gideon finally dropped the mask. "My name isn't Gideon Flint," he said quietly, his gaze fixed on Silas. "I'm Samuel Ward, your brother." The words cut sharper than any blade. Silas stared, searching the man's face. Could it be true? Samuel proved it with a detail no stranger could ever know. A crescent-shaped birthmark on Silas's left ankle, something he had hidden his whole life, embarrassed by its odd shape. His father had once called it a sideways horseshoe, a charm for good luck.
only family could have carried that memory. And then came another revelation, one that twisted the moment tighter. Samuel wasn't just a brother lost to time. He was a federal marshal, undercover for 5 long years, digging into the consortium's corruption. The land theft, the forged claims, the blood spilled in the name of greed, all of it was part of his mission. It's a haunting thought, isn't it? That sometimes the people who vanish from our lives aren't gone by chance, but because they're fighting battles we can't even see. Silas had spent his life believing he was alone. Yet here stood his brother, revealing that the fight had always been a family fight. The question now was simple, but deadly. Could Silas trust him? Or had the years apart, the secrets, and the bloodshed already built a wall too high to climb?
The stillness around Mercy's cabin shattered in an instant. The first shot rang out like thunder across the valley, and suddenly the air was alive with smoke, splinters, and the echo of gunfire. Silas dove behind the woodpile just as a bullet tore through the post where his head had been seconds before. His chest heaved, the taste of dust and fear sharp in his mouth. Mercy, steady as a hawk, swung her rifle and dropped one of Stone's men with a crack that seemed to shake the ground itself. Samuel was already moving, fast and precise, firing low and forcing the outlaws to scatter for cover. His bullet found Marcus Stone's shoulder, spinning the man around but not dropping him. Stone was tougher than he looked, his eyes burning with rage even as blood soaked his coat. It's strange, isn't it? How some men seem to draw strength from hatred, as though spite itself keeps them standing when they should have fallen. For Silas, the fight was chaos, wood splintering, Mercy's voice shouting over the crack of rifles, the thud of boots pounding the dirt. He realized he'd been marked for death before he even had a chance to choose the kind of man he wanted to be. I think we've all had moments, in smaller ways, where life throws us into a fight we never asked for. Sometimes survival is about finding the courage to keep moving, even when the odds are stacked against you. As the outlaws closed in, Samuel slid beside Silas, his face grim but focused. "Listen to me," he said, gripping Silas's shoulder. "The papers you carried, they're only part of the truth. I've gathered more. Testimonies, records, copies of the lies they thought they buried. We have enough to bring them down." That moment wasn't just about bullets or survival, it was about trust. Could Silas believe that this man, his brother, a stranger for most of his life, was really fighting for him? Was it possible that everything he'd endured, the pain, the mystery, the burden carried in his own flesh, had been part of something larger than himself? Gunfire still split the morning air, the fight far from finished, but deep inside, Silas felt something shift. For the first time, he wasn't just running from the past, he was standing with it, side by side, ready to face whatever storm was coming next. The ridge above Mercy's cabin shook with the thunder of hooves. For a moment, Silas thought it was Stone's man closing in to finish the job, but then he saw the flash of blue coats cutting through the dust. Territorial rangers, riding hard with purpose. It felt like the first breath after drowning. Samuel fired a single shot into the air, a signal that had been planned long before this day arrived. The lead rider, a weathered veteran named Captain Morrison, swung down from his saddle with the calm of a man who had faced down worse storms. He didn't hesitate, his eyes locked on Samuel. "Marshal Ward," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "we received your message." That one word, Marshal, hung in the air like a bell tolling. Mercy's hand eased from her rifle, and Silas, for the first time, felt the truth settle in his chest. His brother wasn't just a drifter with secrets. He was law, and the law had come to level the playing field. With the Rangers forming a line behind him, Morrison extended his hand. Silas stepped forward, pulling the weathered papers from inside his shirt. The documents that had been buried in his own flesh for decades now looked small in his grasp, but their weight was immeasurable. He handed them over, trembling but resolute. Samuel wasn't done. From inside his coat, he produced a leather portfolio, stuffed with testimonies, forged surveys, and bank records. 5 years' worth of proof. Proof that men like Marcus Stone had built their power on lies and blood.
I think that's a powerful moment, don't you? When the evidence finally speaks louder than bullets, when justice steps out from the shadows? Morrison's face hardened as he read, each page adding Stone to his anger. Then his voice rang out clear. Marcus Stone, you are under arrest for fraud, conspiracy, and the murder of Thomas Ward. Stone's bravado faltered. His men, seeing the Rangers' rifles trained steady, backed away like wolves who'd lost their hunger. The man who once seemed untouchable now stood cornered, bleeding, the truth laid bare. For Silas, it was more than an arrest. It was the first crack of light after years of darkness. His father's death finally had a name. His family's honor finally had a voice. And as the Rangers shackled Stone and led his men down the mountain, Silas realized the burden he had carried all his life had transformed into something else. Justice finally given shape.
When the dust finally settled on that ridge, the story had shifted forever. Marcus Stone, the man who once seemed untouchable, was shackled like a common thief. His empire, built on lies and stolen land, crumbled under the weight of proof that could no longer be buried. For Silas, watching Stone led away by the Rangers wasn't just justice served, it was the ending of a nightmare he hadn't even known he was living. The truth came heavy but clear. His father hadn't died in some meaningless accident. He had been murdered because he dared to stand against corruption, because he believed the truth was worth more than power. And now, decades later, his sons were the ones to finish the fight he started. I can't help but wonder, what does it mean to inherit not just land or blood, but a mission, a cause that demands you carry it forward even when it nearly costs you everything? Silas also found something he thought was gone forever: family. Samuel, the brother he never knew, wasn't just an ally in the shadows. He was flesh and blood, bound by both pain and purpose. And in that moment, belongingness Silas had carried his whole life cracked open, replaced by the unexpected weight of belonging. Have you ever experienced that? When someone you thought was lost, whether a person or maybe even a part of yourself, suddenly returns, and you realize you weren't as alone as you believed? And then there was the ranch, the land that had been stolen on paper, but never truly in spirit. With the documents finally unsealed, Silas stood as the rightful heir, not just to a stretch of dirt and fence lines, but to the honor his father left behind. That's something I find deeply moving. The idea that land can be more than property. It can be memory, sacrifice, and a promise carried across generations. As Silas, Samuel, and Mercy walked down that trail together, there was no mistaking the feeling. Justice had spoken. Family had been restored, and the long-buried truth had clawed its way into the light. The scar on Silas's back would never fade, but now it carried a different weight. Not a burden, but a reminder. A reminder that even in the wild frontier, where greed often won and violence ruled the day, courage and truth could still prevail.